Good day. Welcome to the Ancient Warfare podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Brouwers, editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. I'm joined tonight by some of our regular panelists, Lindsay Powell, Murray Dam, and we also have an expert here tonight to join us, Roel Konijnendijk, a PhD student from University College in London. Tonight we're going to be talking about issue 7.5 on Xenophon, and more specifically the March of the 10,000 based on his Anabasis. And to kick off, as always, here is Michael Taylor's introduction.
Next to Caesar's commentaries, the Anabasis of Xenophon represents the most complete description we have of an ancient military campaign. Xenophon was a young Athenian aristocrat who studied under Socrates. The political climate in Athens in 401 proved quite hostile to young men affiliated with Socrates. The Athenians had finally overthrown the tyrannical puppet government installed by Sparta after the Peloponnesian War. And the most bloodthirsty of these Spartan puppets had been Critias, another student of Socrates. Xenophon therefore jumped at an invitation to join a mercenary army and campaign under Cyrus, the brother of the Persian king Artaxerxes. Cyrus had been a major architect of the Spartan victory during the Peloponnesian War, having provided the Spartans with the money and ships that they needed to finally defeat Athens. Using contacts formed during the war, Cyrus now gathered an enormous army, supposedly for a campaign in the Anatolian highlands, but in reality for a daring bid to overthrow his brother. Cyrus recruited over 13,000 Greek mercenaries, mostly from the Peloponnese, in addition to the levies from his own provinces in Asia Minor. Cyrus then began a steady march into the heartland of the Persian Empire. While the mercenaries nearly revolted when they found out they had been recruited to fight a Persian civil war, they agreed to march on in exchange for extra pay. At the Battle of Cunaxa, fought in modern-day Iraq, the Greeks in Cyrus's army performed well, routing the king's forces. Cyrus, however, was killed, leaving the victorious Greeks trapped in Mesopotamia. A temporary truce was effected, but this ended when the commanders of the Greek army were invited to a feast, thrown into chains, and carted off to be decapitated before the king. The Greek mercenaries elected new leaders, one of whom was Xenophon himself. They then began a journey to the Black Sea, where they hoped they might obtain ships and return to the Greek mainland. Harassed intermittently by Persian forces, the Greeks lived off the land, ruthlessly pillaging the peoples they passed through. Their first view of the Black Sea produced one of the most famous moments in Western literature, as the soldiers rejoiced with cries of "Thalata, Thalata!" The sea, the sea. Their ordeal was not over, and indeed the army lost cohesion, briefly splitting into two parts over disagreements as to how best to obtain booty. By now, only 6,000 men remained. They briefly found employment fighting under the Thracian dynast Seuthes. Finally, in 399, the Spartan general Thebrone arrived in Asia Minor, with the mission of liberating the Greek cities from Persian rule. The Spartan fleet put an end to the mercenaries' freebooting, and the survivors were drafted into the Spartan expeditionary force.
So that was Michael's introduction, which gave a brief overview of the contents of the issue. He also wrote the introduction, so if you pick up the issue, be sure to read his article to get a general idea for the contents of the issue as a whole. Perhaps a good point to kick off the conversation here would be to talk a little bit about Xenophon himself and his status both in antiquity as well as today as an author and a historian and perhaps also a philosopher. So I would like to weigh in on this.
Well, I think the thing about Xenophon is that the modern status of Xenophon is he's an odd figure because he's occupies such an important period he knew such important people and did such important things. But modern authors tend to disparage him and write him off, that he's not on an equal status with Plato in regards to his relationship with Socrates. And the memorabilia is a footnote to the Platonic dialogues, which it shouldn't be. It should be equal status. In fact, the figure of Socrates that comes out of the memorabilia is so much more attractive than Plato's figure, in my opinion. Also, in terms of him as an author, he sort of gets written off, and he's sort of just not respected. And it's really interesting when you compare the Anabasis, for instance, compared where he talks about himself in the third person with Julius Caesar, who talks about himself in the third person. Xenophon gets none of the credit that Caesar does for putting himself into the third person. Similarly, when you look at his didactic writings on cavalry command and things like that, they are written off. They're regarded as unimportant, but they're really interesting in terms of the training of troop in the 4th and centuries. There's so many things that Xenophon contributes to in so many fields, like the Cyropaedia, in terms of it being written off as a romance novel. But in fact, again, it's like a training manual. It has this, yes, it's set in a past generation to give it a context, but that's no different to what so many Greek stories did. And yet Xenophon isn't given credit for any of that. He's sort of dismissed as unimportant, whereas I think that his status should be much higher. And when you start to read the ancient accounts of Xenophon, he does have that status, and yet that isn't continued in modern scholarship.
Yeah, we need to remember that he's one of the most prolific writers of the classical period that is extant. There's many, many authors for whom we have much less, especially the other historians, of whom we have only one work, and in Thucydides' case, it's not even finished. I mean, that's as far as it goes. But, Xenophon has contributed so much more, and not just in terms of contributions to existing genres, but also creating genres entirely, as far as we can tell, from scratch. The Cyropaedia, while being, as you say, also a training manual and many other, can be interpreted in many other ways, it's also the first historical novel of which we know. The Anabasis is the first travel account of which we know, and his account of the cavalry commander is the first military manual of which we know. So, he has really enriched our conception of literature by producing all these really adventurous kind of conceptual works.
So why do modern academics sort of denigrate him so much? It seems to be they go for Plato and all these other great stage names, but he seems to earn a position and hasn't got it.
I mean, it is sort of coming back. For the last 20 years, people have been reasserting Xenophon and realizing that there's actually a lot in there. But for a long time, partly it's because he writes very easy Greek, and people just like to compare that to Thucydides and say, look, this is what a proper intellectual sounds like. Xenophon is just kind of muddying about, and he's a bit of an idiot. But another thing is that a lot of his work is open to criticism for the things that he leaves out and for the bias that he supposedly puts in. Simply because, he isn't like Thucydides trying to bring together the two sides of the story and trying to represent it in what we assume to be a very balanced and well thought out way. In many cases, especially in the Hellenic, he seems to sketch a situation from one side only. And so people get the impression that he's really not being very thorough, not being very critical, and that he's just kind of writing down what he hears and not doing anything with it. That's been one of the reasons why people disparage him, especially as a historian. As for his philosophies, people just think he's not as sophisticated as Plato, so he must be stupid, he must not get Socrates. There's that famous quote from Bertrand Russell, who said, a stupid man's report of what a clever man says can never be accurate, because he unconsciously translates what he hears into something he can understand. People don't really know this, but he's talking about Xenophon. He's talking about Xenophon describing Socrates, and he's saying Xenophon is too dumb to understand what Socrates was doing. And so the way that he describes Socrates is just wrong, because he doesn't get it. Which is, of course, us projecting our idea of what Socrates should be like onto the past and saying Xenophon doesn't understand that. But that's entirely just our preconceptions of how great and glorious these Greeks were. And the same goes when you compare his historiography with Thucydides. You're just saying, this is what the Greeks should be like. Xenophon doesn't quite make it, therefore Xenophon must be a bad apple.
Yeah, it's a very relatively new phenomenon. Otherwise, we would never have had so much of Xenophon actually survive through the ages if it wasn't useful. And also, the point that some people raised, that if Xenophon was basically making stuff up as he went along, he would have been criticized in his own day also, which didn't really happen. I mean, the Anabasis, there are loads of people nowadays that sort of say, oh, Xenophon paints himself into a very favorable light, or writes stuff about other people that cannot possibly be right. The problem, of course, was that there were still loads of people around, kicking around from the 10,000 that would have been able to say, hey, hang on a minute, this Xenophon guy, he's making things up as he goes along. And that never happened. So there is reason to assume that Xenophon isn't as bad as a lot of modern scholars seem to think. Does anybody else want to mention something about the Anabasis in particular?
I like the cover of the Penguin edition.
The fact that it's a rollicking good read.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Anabasis is like this exciting boys' adventure story, basically. It's like
yeah, without needing to change a word. And we were talking about the fact that it's, in a modern sense, hasn't been adapted for film, but it's crying out to be adapted for film without changing an event. And of course, that's a pipe dream when it comes to movie adaptations, of course, because there'll have to be some change, because clearly what happened, or even Xenophon's version of what happened, isn't exciting enough for the film industry. But that idea of being isolated in enemy territory has been used in other literature and other film. But The Warriors from 1980 is still the most well-known Anabasis and adaptation into film, which is quite strange.
Although I wonder what happens if you really try to look into this and see how many stories have this pattern where a bunch of people get sort of invited or end up by their military campaigns behind enemy lines and have to fight their way back. I think this, anytime this theme appears in modern literature, it may have something, or may owe something to his basic structure that he set out. Because as I said, this is a completely new literary concept that he introduced, where he just follows an army around on a campaign and tries to ramp up the emotionality of the events. Really tries to suck us in and make us care.
Any of those films where you've got an elite unit behind enemy lines, so basically any Vietnam War film, but also I think, just thinking about what you said, when you look at the King Arthur, the pretext of King Arthur, where Arthur goes north of Hadrian's Wall after the barbarians have attacked, that's exactly that. He's then trying to get back to civilization through enemy lines. So any of those kinds of ideas, and you look at the entire genre of modern war films, that's what they are. I watched Lone Survivor, and exactly the same sort of thing. You've got four guys trying to get back to safety through, and they're taking advantage of very old traditional Afghani traditions in terms of hospitality, which is something that we have absolutely throughout Greek culture.
And there's the Iron Cross, which is about a bunch of Germans on the Eastern Front who also have to make their way back to their own lines. There's another movie about this during the Ardennes Offensive. It came out a few years ago. I forgot the title, but yeah, it's a very common theme, like to have, as you say, an elite unit caught behind enemy lines has to fight its way back, ultimately.
But at a very deep level, I mean, for example, we've had a US soldier who's brought back, and it appeals to something very deep. I mean, the Bergdahl story has now become very controversial, but the idea that this man is being brought home, so the journey home appeals to people at a very deep level.
It's also the story of the underdog, of course. That you're trapped behind enemy lines, outnumbered, outgunned. It's something that appeals to most people. The few surviving in the face of the many, of course. The weak triumphing over the strong.
Even those Disney films from the 1980s, Incredible Journey, where the cat and the dog are left behind in enemy human territory and make their way home to their owner. And it's all Xenophon. It's all Xenophon.
Maybe that way to bridge the podcast to the next topic about what Xenophon's army really looked like, or rather the army, the 10,000 looked like, of course, and how they operated, because these were not just Greek warriors, not just Greek militiamen, but these were Greek mercenaries, of course. So they were, as we might expect, better trained and perhaps not better equipped, but certainly better prepared than than the average Greek militiaman would have been.
This is very telling quote in Aristotle, and I'm kind of wondering why this wasn't brought up in the volume, but he literally says that, if mercenaries fight against citizens, it's like athletes competing against normal people who have not trained at all. The difference is the same. These people know how to use their weapons. They know what they're doing on the battlefield. I think, though, primarily the difference is not in the fact that they are mercenaries, but that they are mercenaries who are led by Spartan officers, such as Clearchus, such as Chrysippus, who, in my understanding, train their soldiers. They always make them undergo Spartan training when they are being led by a Spartan. So basically, the Spartan wants to be able to rely on his troops, and the way to do so is to make them undergo the same kind of formation drill, which gives the Spartans their edge in battle. And so the longer this army is on the march, the more they become proficient at basically the kind of maneuvering that the Spartan army is famous for, which definitely makes them a force to be reckoned with and far superior to any Greek militia army. Although, I have to say, the article that appeared in the volume by Patrick Baker kind of overstates how much better a Spartan army would be, assuming that a lot of Spartan training consisted of very close formation drill and extensive weapons training, although we really have no evidence for that. It seems that the Spartan advantage in battle was a very basic thing, which meant, they all their front rank troops or officers, everybody else is taught to follow their officers. Ultimately, all of their maneuvering follows from that. But even in that very small way, they had a very significant edge over any other Greek force in the sense that they were able to change the facing of their phalanx. They were able to wheel and countermarch, which no other Greek force could do in the face of the enemy. And that very simple thing that any modern lecturer or trainer will tell you, that you can teach anyone to do this in a few hours, but that very simple thing gave the Spartans a massive edge in battle, and really is the defining feature of what makes their tactics more sophisticated than those of any other Greeks. Now this is definitely what the 10,000 would have had as well.
Did it also, for example, contribute to their stamina, their mental stamina and strength, if you will, to be able to withstand the torments of the march back? I'm just thinking, if you took an ordinary guy if you're told, go to the battlefield, fight, because that's your public duty, as opposed to somebody who does that professionally, I think that person also is better equipped to be able to deal with hardships.
Well, the stamina question is really a big one. It seems that the Greeks obviously had a lot of respect for those who trained their bodies, who went to the gymnasia and really made an effort to to improve their physique. But this was something that only the rich could afford. So there's a good chance, actually, if you took a section of the rich citizens in any given citizen militia, they may have been fitter than mercenaries. But that's a whole other question. The point is that there's no weapons training that we know of. Unless people specifically chose to do so. And very tellingly, when Agesilaus is training his army in Asia Minor a few years after the March of the 10,000, he also has mercenaries, he also has local citizens. Now what he does, he makes his paltas train their throwing javelins, he makes his archers shoot at targets, but he makes his hoplites, it literally says, they're competing who has the best body. He's not they're training their spearmanship or their swordsmanship, they're not training their formations, they're just training their bodies. They just need to be strong, they need to be fit. That is very much the attitude when it comes to what you need to be able to do to endure the hardships of campaigns and battles. And in this sense, it's possible that the 10,000s were also developing this, specifically after the Battle of Cunaxa, when they were just marching all day long together and facing the dangers of the Persians encroaching upon them and following them around. So they would have been sort of constantly under duress and constantly practicing their skill. But before that, it's really not clear whether they would have been superior soldiers in any way. That is simply because Greek training was at such a primitive level and at such a sort of individually inspired scale. You kind of did it if you wanted to. It's very hard to say whether a mercenary force, before it became led by a competent general, would have been better in any way than a militia army.
No, battles usually were not so much decided by one side killing the other, but more or less by breaking the other side's morale. So, like what you said, Raul, if the other side or the mercenaries were more strongly willed than the opponents, then they already had an edge in battle, and then it really doesn't matter all that much how much training that's actually going on if they can maintain those lines. So, but Murray.
Yeah, I think the idea that what the thing that impresses most about the Spartans is their drill, the fact that they're disciplined, but that their ability to march and counter-march and do all of that sort of stuff. And the idea also in the Socratic dialogues and the memorabilia that when you've got up close, you're going to know what to do in terms of stabbing with a spear or a sword, but the rest of the drill of being a hoplite is the important stuff, where you're marching in order, where you know where you're going. The idea that you can march in line and then get into formation or change formation if required. And even later in the Tactica, that again is the idea. It's all about marching formation, not about, and when you get to the enemy line, you stab this way. And so, there's been a lot of work recently on what the overhand strike looks like. I know that Christopher Matthews has got a lot of the stuff that there's a lot more throwing of spears than we have in any literary account, based on the fact that a lot of the spears have a throwing loop. But in the training, it's all about marching. Going to Xenophon's own training, it's all about target throwing. When he's talking to his son about being a best cavalry officer, essentially he's telling him to exceed his men in everything his men do, and therefore to be better at hitting the target from horseback, to be better at that, to know horses. So to know, it's really a template for command, if you like, in the sense that he's telling his son, you need to know all about horses, and there are links between Hipparchus and Xenophon, but it's remarkably insightful. But I think that again, there is the sense you know what to do, and some of the sophists who Socrates attacks are these charlatans who are teaching techniques which are redundant, because when you get up close and personal, you're going to know what to do.
The problem is we don't know what their training consisted of, and we can assume a number of things, but we have to assume the absolute minimum of what we might expect of any force, because the Greeks did not take their training very seriously. Very few of them engaged in any of it, and the Spartans had an edge just by performing a very, very little, as Patrick Baker points out in the article in the issue, is that there is this quote in Aristotle, and there are various other quotes that you can use to support this, that the Spartan edge was just simply in training at all, which Xenophon himself also says in his Constitution of the Spartans, whereas most other Greeks just didn't. And the advantage that a mercenary army like the 10,000 had was primarily in having a long period of joint combat experience, just being able to fight together, developing esprit de corps, developing ad hoc decisions and solutions to known problems that others had to sort of find out on the spot. And the other part is that they had Spartan officers who presumably, but we do not know this for sure, presumably trained them in the basic things that gave the Spartans an edge as well. And these basic things really consist of, the simplest forms of formation drill, such as being able to just have a formation where you follow your front rank officers, where you can wheel, where you can countermarch. Not much more than that.
Do you think there would also have been major differences in equipment compared between the mercenaries and more the militia armies in the city-states?
As far as we know. I mean, by this time, by the end of the 5th and early 4th centuries, it's very clear from both the iconography that we see in city-states and from the account of the Anabasis that hoplites were not wearing basically any armor anymore, that it was difficult to find any hoplite who had more than his shield and spear as his equipment. Maybe the pilot's helmet, just the simple conical helmet that you see so beautifully illustrated on the cover. The main evidence for this actually is when Xenophon decides to build his cavalry force. He expresses how much difficulty it took him, how much difficulty he had in scraping together just 50 cuirasses from more than 10,000 hoplites. He could barely scrape together 50 cuirasses to give to the cavalry to be able to make them effective mounted troops. So the suggestion there is that there weren't just that many cuirasses to go around. And in fact, in his later famous episode where he's running up, this mountainside, and his soldier, his hoplite, yells at him like, "You have it easy because you're sitting on a horse." And he's like, "All right, fair enough then. I'll go and do my duty as a general by leading by example. I get off my horse, I pick up your shield, and I run up the hill with you." But then he specifically says, I was burdened because I also was wearing my cuirass, clearly suggesting none of his hoplites were wearing such armor. None of them were burdened in the same way. So cavalry wears armor, hoplites just don't. At this time, they just don't wear any kind of armor at all.
Yeah, just tunics for the most part, and maybe some linen corselets. I'm not exactly familiar if Xenophon makes a distinction between linen corselets and metal cuirasses. I know that metal cuirasses were considered more or less standard for cavalrymen. It's possible that they were not thought suitable for use on horseback. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, the main thing about bronze is that it's extremely expensive.
That's very interesting psychology, because what they're basically saying, that they are saying that the linen, in fact, doesn't constitute armor. If that's true, whereas we know it actually from a technical perspective is actually very effective. In fact, from the reconstructions that have been made, it's actually a very capable defensive rig that you carry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know who is saying that it's not armor, but throughout the classical sources, you get a very strong impression that this is an entirely acceptable form of body protection. And of course, this goes back to the Iliad. The lesser Ajax is he's the linothorax wearing Ajax. So this is a form of armor that's existed all the way back in archaic period and extends down to Roman times. It's not until the sort of spread of the Celtic invention of chainmail that it really becomes an outdated form of armor.
But my point was, though, that in a sense, what they're saying is that your landlubbers, if you were going to kind of do it like this, wearing linen aren't as good as us, so we sweat it out in metal. So, you're second-class citizens, is really what that maybe infers.
No, not at all. I don't think that's a distinction that is made as such, mostly because linen corselets, as far as I know, aren't necessarily a whole lot cheaper than metal cuirasses. It's just, I think, maybe something that gets associated with cavalrymen for the most part, because it's something that has to be made to a very tight, specific fit, more so than the linen corselets, as far as I know.
Well, one of the things you need to bear in mind, I mean, Xenophon says that his cavalry should be equipped with metal, but that, of course, does not suggest that they always were. Whereas we get from iconography, we get the impression that, and especially later on in Macedonian cavalry, that they commonly wore linen armor, not, bell cuirasses or anything like that.
There's a very famous Alexander mosaic, of course, that Alexander arrayed in his mostly linen cloth.
We're basically increasingly focusing on mobility and on the fact that their formation and their shields would protect them sufficiently. They wouldn't need to burden themselves further with additional body armor. If you take the impression that you get from the articles in the volume, you get the idea that a lot of them were still wearing these linen cuirasses, and the men on horseback would be wearing leather, spoli, things like that. Actually, the impression you get from Xenophon is that there was almost no body armor to be found among the 10,000. What little they had went to this cavalry force. Presumably, a lot of that armor would have also been linen rather than bronze, which is not necessarily worse in any way. It's just less prestigious, less shiny, less beautiful, possibly less expensive. That is obviously, something that we're not entirely clear on. But, the common hoplite would not be wearing armor. He would possibly be wearing his pilos helmet, but mainly he would be a hoplite because he had a big shield, the aspis, and because he had his spear. And we really need to see the rest as simple, as minimalist as possible. Xenophon describes the phalanx when they're arrayed in battle formation. They're this wall of, as he says, bronze and scarlet. Essentially, bronze is the shield, scarlet is the tunic. That's what you get. There's no white. There's no shining metal, shining linen, anything like that. There are no Corinthian plumed helmets flying up all over the place. They're just sort of bronze shields, red tunics. That's it.
Yeah, I think the centerfold illustration has a few good pictures of the lighter equipped hoplites, as well as some of the linen corselet ones. It's of course an issue with making illustrations, is that you also wanted to be visually interesting, and that's a bit of a problem maybe sometimes in making illustrations for the magazine, in that the amount of nice armor gets exaggerated, perhaps. There's also still quite a few Corinthian helmets in the issue, less than they were originally, I have to say, because I was trying to dissuade the use of loads of Corinthian helmets, largely because after about 450 BC they become exceedingly rare. There is maybe one instance that dates to the late 4th or early 3rd century BC, but after that they really seem to have died out completely. But still, Corinthian helmets are so interesting to see, and that it's very difficult to get illustrators to stop.
Well, they're iconic, of course, and a hoplite who wears only a tunic and a pilos helmet. It just doesn't look like the hoplite that we imagine when we think of the word hoplite. He doesn't look like this great glorious warrior wearing, head to toe in bronze with this iconic, Corinthian helmet covering his entire face and the big plume that makes him look so intimidating. It's much more about, creating that image. But in reality, I mean, they just wouldn't have looked very intimidating when you draw him out like that, just with his big round shield and no body armor whatsoever, just on his sandals with a pilos helmet, with a little point on his head.
If the Greeks are going to war in textiles, well, apparently so are the Parthians, the Persians rather. So they're quite evenly matched. They're both wearing wool and linen and so on.
That's true for the Persians, entirely up for grabs. I mean, Herodotus describes them wearing scale armor, and Xenophon certainly gives the impression that all the cavalry was well armored. They were just wearing their cuirasses under their tunics, so you wouldn't see them.
Yeah, you'd think that if they were victorious against armored foes and enemies, they would plunder the useful equipment and use it, and so you'd get a much more polyglot force as they went, but that's not what happens. So, maybe there's that whole idea of I'm not going to be a trouser wearer or whatever, and therefore not giving any honor to foreign, foreign armor, and therefore staying with what they had, and therefore getting to the point where they could only sort of scrape together 50 cuirasses.
Well, by that time, they obviously hadn't had much chance to loot anything because they kept getting trounced by the Persian forces. I mean, it's something that only later on do they get the chance to really loot the bodies of any cavalry that they catch. But before that, it wasn't really happening. But I think primarily, like I said, the hoplites wouldn't be doing this because they were deliberately striving to be as light and mobile as possible, which of course served them much better in the environment that they were in than having themselves weighed down with all the armor they could possibly get. I mean, they had to run up hills most of the time, basically. They weren't going to be very happy to load themselves down with massive iron scale armor.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the reasons why the cavalry could afford to be clad in heavier armor, because they had the horses do most of the work anyway. Yeah, there's one point that you raised also to me in email about the shield blazons that are used in the volume in the issue. I remember deliberately having because originally some of the illustrations did feature lambdas on shields to denote that they were used by Spartans, by Lacedaemonian troops, basically. And they were changed deliberately on my orders. I have to take full editorial responsibility here, as I should for every issue, of course, because I had my doubts, and perhaps I was wrong, but that people who were not fighting specifically for the city-state of Sparta or for Laconia or whatever would use shields with the lambda on them, that they would rather use more conventional shield blazons after the archaic model, if you will. I'm not sure if that's something that you would agree with, or that you...
No, I would. I definitely would. The thing is, I mean, the reason why I flagged that up in the issue is that it explicitly says Spartan hoplites training, and then none of those shields carry lambdas, and I think, in that case, they definitely would have. But if it would have said, Spartan mercenaries, or allies trained by a Spartan, then there would be no issue with them having all sorts of different shield blazons. It's just that increasingly during the 4th century in particular, shield blazons become a thing. Like different city-states develop their own sort of fixed pattern. And there is at least one occasion, I think the Battle of Second Mantinea, when other states start painting the Theban club on their shields because they want to be seen as part of the grand Theban army led by Epaminondas. So there is definitely a sense that, you adopt the identity of your commanding or your leading army unit if you feel a particular affinity with them. But of course, I mean, for a mercenary army that is being trained by Spartan, no, they would have had their own blazons. They would have all had their own individual, whatever preference or good luck omen or token or god of their patron god or whatever. You know, there are so many different designs known from pottery, and there's no reason why those mercenaries would have had the same one.
Yeah, those city-specific blazons are something that first appeared during the Peloponnesian Wars.
Yeah, there are a couple of famous episodes where they pop up. You know, there's the battle at the Long Walls of Corinth, where there is some Spartan cavalry present, but they don't like fighting as cavalry, and they're meant to be a reserve force. But when the Sicyonians, who are their allies, they break and they run away, the Spartans stop them, take over their shields, and decide to make a stand as infantry. And then there's actually the Spartan commander actually calls out to the advancing Argives. He says, "By the gods, these sigmas will deceive you." He's saying, you know, there are sigmas on the shield for Sicyon, but actually we are Spartans, so these should be lambdas. You know, we're going to beat you up, and you're going to think that we are Sicyonians, but you'll be deceived. So there's that sense that, you know, the shield blazon at that point for certain cities was already so iconic and so well known that you would recognize, oh, those are Sicyonians, they've got the sigma. Those are Spartans because they've got the lambda. And this becomes more and more of a thing. You know, as I said, by 362 you have the Theban club, the Club of Hercules, which they sort of all have on their shields and which they are identified by. Presumably by that time a lot of Athenians would have had the owl on their shields and things like that, but we don't really know all of them. We only hear about a few.
So maybe this is a good point to talk more generally about mercenaries in Greece, because it used to be thought, I don't think it's really maintained anymore seriously, that mercenaries were a feature mostly of the 4th century, or that they suddenly exploded for various reasons, whereas of course mercenary service as a viable ancient Greek career path, if you wish, dates back at least to the 7th century, possibly even to the late 8th century, and there are some indications that Greeks were already serving as mercenaries in the late Bronze Age, on Crete perhaps, and among the Hittites. So it's clear that mercenaries is something that the Greeks engaged in throughout the Mediterranean from an early period onwards, and probably not specific to the 4th century BC as such.
I mean, as every author I think about who's written about Greek mercenaries has flagged up, basically what we see is not a rise of mercenaries in the 4th century, but rather a gap in the 5th. We know mercenaries are constantly being used in the Archaic period. Everybody's doing mercenary service in all over the Mediterranean, basically. And then in the 5th century, suddenly this seems to stop. We don't hear about it so much. And in the 4th century, it rises again. But what's always struck me is that when, during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians and later the Spartans and others start drafting mercenaries, those mercenaries are available. So it's not like they have to go out and ask people, you know, you can do this thing where I pay you and you fight for me. They don't have to go and make an effort. They don't have to try and sort of raise this sort of general outcry saying, we're looking for soldiers. If you're looking for, you know, be all you can be, come join the Spartan army. It's literally just an offhanded remark. They raised, you know, 700 or I don't know how many, I think 600 or 700 Peloponnesian mercenaries. They're just there. And again, for the Athenians, you know, they've got 1,300 Thracian peltasts coming in. These kind of things, they're just available. So there clearly is a sense that this market is there, but it's not being talked about. And that is the real problem. Like, we just don't know about it, but it must have been there. Otherwise, how could this continuity exist? How is it possible that, you know, mercenaries, as you say, were a very big deal in the Archaic period and possibly before that, and very big deal in the late Classical period? How can we explain this gap? And the truth is that we can't. We just don't have the sources to fill it up. But it seems very likely that either these mercenaries were still being hired all over the place, we just don't hear about it, or that for whatever reason, the city-states just didn't feel like hiring, like they needed mercenaries, but others continued to do so. I mean, they could have been hired out to the Persian Empire, to Thrace, to any other part of the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, we just don't hear about it.
Yeah, and also I think historiographically, the way that Herodotus frames the the city-state defense of Marathon, and then also in the later Persian wars, the emphasis of that tends to have a more unifying aspect than, we hired a whole bunch of guys who fought for us. So there, I think also is a sort of a bias in the historiography as well, that tends to be what the emphasis is on city-states defending their land. And then similarly, well, our hired bunch of guys fought your hired bunch of guys, what do we care, isn't the way that the Peloponnesian War is framed, that it's that not only city-state against city-state, but also philosophical battle of this is our political agenda versus your political ideals, and which again, if it's termed in mercenary hireage, doesn't have the same kind of impact. So I think exactly that it is possibly happening. It's just not being emphasized.
Yeah, Thucydides puts an emphasis on alliances rather than mercenary services. That's why he also refers to the Levantine War, for example, as an example of the first time that most of Greece was united in alliances against the other part of Greece. So yeah, it could be deliberate propaganda on the part of Thucydides in this case to sort of hide or obscure the fact that maybe they're using slightly more than just friends.
So one thing I would like to stress actually is the importance of money. I mean, the 5th century states may simply not have been able to support mercenaries on a grand scale, whereas 4th century states, I mean, it's almost like there's a shift in priorities where they moved their major state expenses from either maintaining large fleets and building these great sort of prestigious buildings, etc., to maintaining mercenaries to continue their fight against each other. And of course, at this point, it becomes clear that mercenaries are simply superior soldiers to citizens because they fight better, they know their weapons better, they know their drill better, they know their officer hierarchies, etc. So they perform better. You need to be able to afford them. And the thing about this that you could construct a grand narrative of state formation, which of course is being done especially more recently by Hans van Wees, where you see the rise of the sort of centralized state financial system at the end of the 6th century. And then for a long time, this continues to develop in Athens, and for a long time it continues to develop elsewhere in Greece. And it's not until that process has to some extent been completed that states are able to mobilize the resources of their population and hire mercenaries. And I think this may have had to do with it to some extent, because of course in the archaic period, most of the use of mercenaries is either by tyrants or by people who have such means and such connections that they can simply raise these forces out of their own pocket, but states do not have the financial structures to support it. So I think this definitely will have to do with it, that by the 4th century states have developed to such an extent in Greece that mercenaries can become a common thing, and then they promptly are.
Yeah, I've read the suggestion before that
the other
money, coinage, that coinage was originally invented specifically to make large-scale state payments easier, especially also for the payment of mercenaries, for example.
I think the other thing, of course, after the end of the Peloponnesian War is that possibly the price of mercenaries goes down. That there are veterans who no longer have other career paths, so to speak, and therefore because there's more supply than possibly needed. There's anecdotes about the Peloponnese being the base of mercenaries, and sort of people standing on isthmuses waiting to be picked up so that they can be used as mercenaries.
There's always been difficult arguments.
There's possibly a glut of trained soldiers.
There's always been a difficult argument, though, because the regions don't overlap. Like, the regions that are affected by the Peloponnesian War are not the same regions that then end up sending all the mercenaries. Most of them come from Achaia and Arcadia, which are notably the regions that are mostly unaffected by the Peloponnesian War. So the fact that they are the ones who have the surplus of men, it seems almost to contradict the idea that it's because of the strains of war and the fact that all these men have lost their other means of income, of survival and sustenance, and must rely on their skills in warfare. It seems that something else is going on there, but it's very difficult to see what it is.
True.
So perhaps at this point it's good to touch on a particular topic that we didn't really deal with in this particular issue, and that's the special units that were a part of the army of the 10,000, they were also among the most sophisticated fighters in the classical Greek world.
Right. The interesting thing is, I mean, I do believe that Sidney Dean flagged these up when he wrote his account of the sort of the opening phases of the march. Like, he noted that at some point the Greeks decide that when they're passing through a narrow defile or they're crossing a bridge or a river, their formation, there's this hollow square that they adopt to protect themselves against the Persians. This starts to fall apart and turns into a chaotic sort of scramble to get through or to get across. And the way they decide to try and solve this is that they draft from, or they pick from their forces a number of about 600 picked men, which they organize into separate units with very, very detailed officer hierarchies, which is very interesting. We only see them here and for the Spartan army elsewhere. So they have these very, very tightly organized and controllable small units, which they then use to try and sort of maintain order in the marching column when such a narrow point is reached. But then later on, during the march, you keep seeing these units reappearing as guards of the sort of the rear guard of the army, as the vanguard of the army, as the special units that are used to assault strong positions, to cover bridge crossings, etc. And then eventually, and this is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Anabasis and the March of the 10,000, eventually they're being used in pitched battles against local tribes and eventually against the Bithynians, who are obviously living in sort of the northwestern corner of what is now Turkey. And they're used in battle in ways that are never seen anywhere else in all of Greek tactics. They are used, for instance, in a checkered front line, in which they are sort of drafted as blocks, 100 by 1 or 10 men by 10 men, wide and deep, and there is space in between them, which is filled up with archers and light troops, and they are made to advance up a hillside in this way because it allows them to maintain their formation. It allows them to offer mutual support. Now, these are manipular tactics. This is what we know from Roman warfare. We don't see this anywhere else in the entirety of Greek warfare. This happens only once on that one occasion, and it is those troops, those small units of 100 men that are sort of subdivided and that have their own officers that are capable of carrying this out. Later on, they're also seen acting as a second line, like the whole entire phalanx of the rest of the hoplites is drawn up as a front line, and then these 600 men, these picked troops, are lined up behind them, specifically and explicitly in Xenophon, to provide support wherever the phalanx is being broken through, or wherever the phalanx, the front line, might need support. So they are a tactical reserve. Now again, we see this a number of times in Greek battles, but rarely so explicitly and so numerous. So these orthiolochi, these special units, which are drafted initially to have a very sort of simple and straightforward purpose, eventually end up being sort of the flying squad, the fire brigade of the entire 10,000. They end up doing things that no other Greek force, including the Spartans, is ever seen to do in battle. And this is very interesting because to me it suggests that it is because they have been sort of through this entire march, through this long, prolonged period of being in danger and being in combat together, they've developed their tactical ability, and they've perfected it to a degree that not even Spartans, who are ostensibly supposed to spend all their lives training for war, not even the Spartans have ever been able to match. And I think this is because, firstly, they're picked troops in small units. They were drafted from an army that was already trained by Spartans and already had combat experience, but they are taken from that, presumably because they were the best, the most trained, the most fit of those troops. They were then exposed to danger for a very prolonged period, and they were forced to react to various conditions and situations that they were unfamiliar with. They were able to develop their skills to a level that no other Greek army was ever able to match.
You don't see any evidence for something like that similar in I don't remember anything like that in Herodotus, for example, but Thucydides I don't recall in any great detail that are even similar to those kinds of tactics. But since I don't think Xenophon points them out as something new, right? So
no, the thing is, there's plenty of evidence of picked troops being used all over the place, and the idea is always to have a small unit that you can easily control and maneuver, because the main body of hoplites not having any kind of officer hierarchy and not being sort of trained in any sense as in formation drill or in weapons training, they can't be controlled. So you need small troops to be able to do any kind of tactical maneuvering or tactical response. And so these small troops have been around, as far back as Plataea we see them being used. So Herodotus reports them, Thucydides reports them. Thucydides also reports battle reserves, tactical reserves being held back or being positioned in a particular place to watch for an attack there and being eventually thrown into the fight at the critical moment. And they clearly understood this concept. But the way in which the two are merged and the way in which units are really conceived of as being separate and independent entities during the March of the 10,000, that is something that we just don't see anywhere else. And even the Spartan army, its great strength is that it's able to maneuver large numbers, large bodies of troops, but we never see them, operating independently and having a couple of locoi or a couple of units do this while the other units do that. There's no sign of that anywhere else. It is just because these picked troops have this sort of extreme sort of mutual shared battle experience, but also have had so much opportunity to train their ability to respond to circumstances that they can now do this at the end of the March of the 10,000 to a degree that most Spartan armies, which only see a campaign once every few years or maybe even less than that, they just haven't had that opportunity to practice that and to develop that.
But that sort of long shared experience, is that the reason that it's not picked up as a standard, that you just, because generally your warfare isn't that common, that you don't have those men with shared experience, and therefore you training that kind of elite unit, so to speak, group is something but much trickier and therefore circumstance specific. Even the idea of a reserve, that possibly it doesn't get picked up because the training and the long-standing shared experience isn't there, and it sort of becomes a kind of a, to be posted in reserve in traditional Greek warfare is almost an insult, as opposed to a strategic necessity and therefore a vital cog in the wheel. But that you would need to know that, as opposed to you guys are going to go and stand over there and help us if we get in trouble, is in sort of Greek cultural terms not a good thing to be. That's not the position you.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, I would definitely argue the reason why this doesn't develop elsewhere is that there is simply no army that can match their degree of experience and the extent to which they've been served together, and possibly also the status that they have acquired by being this fire brigade. I mean, that doesn't happen very often. Of course, we do see standing picked units elsewhere, most famously the Sacred Band of Thebes, but even they do not carry out anything nearly as complicated as that. And my answer to that would be is that they just don't have extended combat experience, exactly as you say. They may have had long, extensive training, but mostly, again, in athletics and possibly formation drill. We don't know that. But they haven't had that extensive combat experience. They don't know what it's like to fight together. They've only done that maybe a few times. It's interesting to note Plutarch says that the Spartans, by fighting the Thebans, taught them how to wage war, because they're giving them practice in having all sorts of minor battles and skirmishes and that sort of thing. They're being trained in that. But there is no extended exposure to mortal danger such as what happened during the 10,000. Definitely. This is a unique event, and that is exactly why they are able to develop to a degree that no one else sort of gets to. Although I would dispute the idea. I mean, it's very explicit in various Greek authors that to have a reserve is a very well understood concept, and exactly as you say, they are being told before the battle, interfere when you're needed, interfere when you see us crumbling or when you see any part of the army that needs help. That's when you step in. Cavalry is being told, and cavalry are the glory boys. The fact that they are being denied an immediate role, but they're being told interfere and help us out when you can. This really shows that this is not something that the Greeks would sort of instinctively deny or reject. It's something that they've clearly adopted. It's just that the way that it's being done in 10,000 is so incremental to the battle plan. It is so, adaptable to circumstances. It's not simply them saying, like, you wait over there and see what happens. It's literally like, go with the rest of the army, march along with them, and see whenever anything happens and be able to respond to circumstances very much in a sort of Auftragstaktik kind of way. It's really very, very sophisticated, and there is no evidence of that ever being matched anywhere, even when units have had, extended periods of training.
Not until Alexander the Great's army, perhaps.
Well, quite possibly, but then, most of his tactical sophistication comes from the use of the cavalry, which he personally leads, whereas this is much more about having units operate independently.
Yeah. Now I'm thinking about the Hypaspists in Alexander's army. That sort of function, that function like kind of like elite troops, where they have these different duties, also these night operations and all this other stuff that they do, sort of like the picked troops in the Anabasis, basically.
Yeah, you see picked troops doing this throughout Greek warfare, but most of the time they are picked because such an operation arises, that need is there. It's not until later that they become sort of these permanent standing forces. But even then, there's nothing like the Orthioi Lokoi, the picked troops of 10,000, simply because they just don't get that many opportunities to come into action, and so they can't anticipate what kind of challenges they will face in quite the same way.
Those kinds of manipular tactics that the 10,000 used in one or two instances, could they have been inspired by Persian tactics in that regard? This close cooperation between heavy troops and light troops, or shock infantry and range troops and that sort of stuff.
Well, it would be very interesting to suggest that. The problem is we just don't know enough about the level of professionalism of the Persian army. I mean, we get the impression that at least the core infantry of most Persian armies were composed of elite Persian nobles and did receive training, at least for some extent of their service period, possibly for several years. And of course, when you see a formation 10 deep, you might immediately think, oh, that must be the decimal system that the Persians used to organize their military forces. But at the same time, we simply don't see Persians ever carrying out tactics of that level of sophistication either. And so to say so, I would find it very attractive as a proposition, because I do believe we should envision the Persian army as being far more professional than any Greek army. But at the same time, we just don't have any concrete evidence that this is what they would have done.
No, yeah, the problem is that the Persians didn't write such detailed treatises on their own military operations, and that the only sources we have are basically from their enemies, written by their enemies. So it's yeah.
Roll had something to say about the reenactment?
Basically, my point is that if you're taking the images in ancient warfare as an example to build your war games or to create reenactment material, and there are very beautiful pictures, but I think they represent hoplite equipment in particular for an earlier period, possibly about the middle of the 5th century, and you need to be thinking of hoplites in terms of just wearing a tunic, a pilos helmet, and a shield only.
Right.
And obviously,
so the reenactors in the article are possibly wearing slightly too much.
There's also, the reenactors who are being brought in to show what the cavalry would have looked like. They're wearing a spolas, which they take to be leather armor. And as it says in the article, the only evidence for that is the fact that Pollux, a very, very late lexicographer, says so. It seems that Xenophon actually uses the spolas as a synonym for thorax, or possibly even as an item of clothing, and does not actually imply that this is any kind of different armor from what he is otherwise talking about. It is much more likely that armor would have been made of linen. Definitely every sort of vase image that depicts these things, every kind of account that we have strongly suggests, or even outright states, that they're made of linen, and that there is not much leather armor known at all in Greece. So to suggest that this is meant to be leather is really going by the flimsiest of evidence to try and counteract a world of evidence to suggest that they are supposed to be linen cuirasses. There's a book that came out very recently about from 3 Americans who have really made a very, very detailed study of linen body armor. And in their opening chapters, they collect all the literary references to these things, and they make a very strong case that this interpretation of the armor, the linothorax, as actually being made of leather is really very, very weak. We need to be thinking of this as linen armor. So again, this is a point to reenactors who are trying to take inspiration from these articles. Definitely make sure you get the linen, not the leather alternative, because there seems to be almost no evidence that even existed.
The book, I just want to say, has been reviewed on the Ancient Warfare blog by me very favorably. I must say, I think it's the definitive book on the linen armor, and indeed, like Roel said, it collects all of the evidence, and it clearly points out that the spolas, there is no reason to assume that it was made from leather. There's also a good economic reason in that large amounts of leather hides would have been relatively rare, prohibitively expensive, probably increased to manufacture loads of armor from. So, but it's something that reenactors love making, this leather armor, and also Hollywood is very much in love with depicting leather armor, and it influences, of course, it has a very strong influence. Also, when you look at the Roman situation, where you look at something like the movie Gladiator, where men run around in leather armor, leather cuirasses, there is very little to almost no ancient evidence for all that leather stuff, whereas linen and metal were used. And those interested in the book but not able to buy it or not wanting to buy it immediately, there is a very detailed summary basically of the book in Ancient Warfare issue 7.6, which will be the topic of our next podcast, written by the authors Aldred Bartel, on the linen armor, and it goes also into more detail as to how it was made, for example. It's very useful if you want an overview of the subject.
Mm. Even more recently, I watched Pompeii on the plane, and from like the 30th second of the film, the facts were wrong, which was like, okay, let all of that go, throw it out over your shoulder. So the poor people behind me were getting lots of Roman facts thrown at them. But yeah, there, the bad guy Romans were in black leather armor, which, you know, even more than the normal brown leather armor of so many other films. Suddenly we have black leather-clad Roman legionaries, which was yet again a travesty of historical fact.
Well, if you were to fix the Xenophon of the March of 10,000, how would you describe? Because I think you started off by saying it was a returning home story. Is that at its heart what it is, or is there more to it? Are there moral lessons that come out of Xenophon? Are there leadership lessons that come out of Xenophon? What else is there that the story?
Remarkableness of it is the fact that you get a homogeneous group of Greeks in the middle of you know, not just in the middle, vastly far away from home, who choose to return to them despite the odds, despite all of the obstacles, rather than, you know, settle down and found a city, which is an option. And, you know, they remain, you know, not getting into any kind of morals. They remain true to themselves and who they are. And again, that's sort of captured in the moment that they see the sea again. That they, you know, they are home when they see this, you know, thing that they know is connected to their home. So it's a remarkable sort of homogeneity of Greekness, I suppose.
I think that more or less does it for today's podcast.
Combined arms. I haven't said this yet. I've talked a lot about hoplites. We need to stress combined arms.
No, we can do that for a moment.
It's just because, you know, I mean, I was very pleased to find in the issue actually that there's a little article about the Rhodian slingers, because they're often overlooked, but as the enumeration at the beginning points out, you know, there are 2,500 light troops with this army of the 10,000. Which is quite a significant number, considering these are not citizen psiloi. They are actually specialists. They're all Cretan archers, Thracian peltas, Rhodian slingers, eventually. So there is a whole bunch of specialist light troops. And of course, during the retreat, they become enormously important. Without them, there would have been no defense against enemy missile troops, and also there would have been very few troops mobile enough to engage in the kind of maneuvering battles among hilly terrain that they have to engage in order to make it through passes and across heights and to survive. So it's extremely important to stress that the 10,000 was not, you know, as Anderson and other famous historians have said, you know, it was not the march of a hoplite army through a hostile terrain full of light troops and their survival by, you know, being just flexible and fast and well armored. Rather, it was a story of using these different troops with, of course, different geographical origins and different social and military status, combining them in order to be able to respond to any kind of challenge. And this is extremely explicit, you know, more explicit than anywhere else. when Xenophon says, guys, we need to get some cavalry, otherwise we're all going to die. You don't just need hoplites. You need light troops as well, and you need light troops with ranged weapons, and eventually you're going to need cavalry because, as he says, the enemy has tons of cavalry, we have none. So even if we win a battle, we couldn't chase and kill anybody, and if we lose a battle, all of us are going to be wiped out. So there's a very strong sense that they need all the different arms in order to be able to make it through in that struggle. And that's a very important point when you realize how often Greek warfare is considered to be a thing that's all about hoplites, and we're only talking about hoplites, and we're only talking about heavy infantry tactics and all that kind of stuff. It's really important to remember this is an achievement of combined arms warfare.
Yeah, definitely, and in this way too, the 10,000 sort of prefigures, if we can adopt a kind of teleological approach, which we shouldn't, of course, the army of Alexander the Great. Again, you can sort of see this development in the course of time where combined arms becomes more and more important in Greek warfare, and it's arguable, of course, that it wasn't as important in the beginning, but it's definitely something that gets emphasized more in the sources also, or at least it's there, present in the material. You can reconstruct it.
I just wanted to make the brief point that the Greek awareness of the importance of cavalry goes way back. It's not something that they suddenly invent during the 10,000. I mean, Xenophon has all of this rhetoric about how important it is and exactly why, and he has loads and loads of examples throughout his work, and you can cite Thucydides on it, you can cite Herodotus on it. Greeks generally are terrified of facing an enemy that is very strong in cavalry, and they are desperate to try and find ways to respond to that. And the 10,000 is just one of the most explicit examples of them doing so. But they're very much aware that an army of hoplites, especially when it's out in open terrain, when it's out on flat land, is going to be absolutely at the mercy of a cavalry force. So again, it's really important to stress that the 10,000 and the March of the 10,000 is a really great demonstration of how Greek military thinking and their awareness of their needs and their weaknesses is very much tied up with their conceptualization of the three different arms: heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry.
I was just going to make the point that possibly in the Macedonian phalanx, where the front rank and the half rank and the rear rank have more armor than their fellow phalangites, and therefore the idea that you've got a limited amount of armor, but the guy at the back of 8 ranks doesn't need as much armor as the guy at the front ranks. So the idea that your front ranked phalangite is fully armored, then the next one isn't as fully armored but has a greave, and then as they go back in ranks they are wearing less and less until your mid-rank phalangite has exactly what we're talking about here: a helmet, a spear, and a shield. And so maybe that is a sort of a formalizing of what the 10,000 had to do through necessity, or a sort of like, well, you have this responsibility, therefore you get the most armor available. You have much less. Further forward in the ranks, you become more armored and therefore clearly have more status.
I don't think that was necessarily the case in the army of the 10,000, though, where there is more. I know it's been argued before that the hoplite troops were also progressively less armored the further back in the ranks you went, but I have my doubts that was really the case, and whether there is any strong evidence for that.
It's ultimately based on Tacitus saying this about the Germans, I think, and Germanic tribes. There's no evidence of this being true in Greece, but it's very likely in the Archaic period, simply because the wealthy, the great fighters are referred to as the promachoi, those who fight in front, and Tyrtaeus always is urging them, like, get to the front and kill your man, don't hang back. But that is because in that kind of warfare, the formation is still very fluid, and people are sort of falling back if they don't want to fight. They're clumping back together. There's only a thin front rank of people who are actually doing the fighting, mainly by throwing javelins at each other. And so in that kind of situation, it seems quite reasonable that the most well-armored warriors are the most sort of willing to go out in front and face the danger. And the ones hanging further back are the less well-equipped, and those who are sort of not really in it. But later on, I mean, if this even happened, it would suggest that there's a very clear intent behind the way that the phalanx was drawn up, which is not really suggested by anyone else except the Spartans, again, who have this sense of having, front rank officers and have file leaders and file closers and that sort of thing. But this didn't happen anywhere else. This was not common anywhere else. So I don't think that a phalanx would ever have been organized to such a degree unless we're talking about a Spartan one. I mean, it's very telling. Xenophon describes, of course, in his manual for the cavalry commander, he says, the cavalry has a couple of subordinates, and then he says, and I think what he should have is a ton more, and he should have file closers and file leaders and mid-file leaders, etc. And he's describing this whole elaborate officer hierarchy, but he's saying, this is what I think you should do, and then he argues why. This is a very clear sign that this is not what's actually happening. Because otherwise, why would he be saying this or presenting this as an opinion or trying to persuade people to do this? This is very clearly like something that isn't actually going on. So, anybody else except the Spartans, they were just not doing anything like that. And the reason why I would say, maybe the Macedonians picked this up from the Spartans, or maybe they individually came up with this idea. Obviously, it's a very clever thing. And later on in the Hellenistic tacticians, you get this very clear sense that the guys in front need to be the strongest and the biggest and the bravest and the best, and they are leading your whole file forward. And then at the back, you need the more reliable men to keep the rest from running away. So they really thought about file order, which is why they expend so much effort on making sure that if you turn, if you wheel, if you countermarch, the men in front are still going to be the men in front. You can't just turn your formation around. But for Greeks, this was not as important simply because they didn't have such a clearly filtered out formation. And of course, with the 10,000, the problem is that the guys who are facing the music, the guys who are doing all the fighting, what is required of them is not that they are wearing heavy armor so that they're good in close combat. What's required of them is that they're flexible and mobile and fast on their feet, because most of what they need to do is charge out to ward off light armed troops, charge up hills to cover strategic positions, charge out ahead to clear the way. They need to do a lot of running. They don't need to do all that much close combat fighting. So I think the emphasis would have been more on selecting out. And on one occasion, this is actually literally what Xenophon says. He selects from his vanguard the troops that are sort of the most fit. So that the emphasis is on selecting out the men who are able to, to fight quickly, to get places quickly, to run around in armor. They need to be sort of lightly equipped rather than heavily. And of course, young, lightly armored, in every way mobile. And this, of course, it allows them also to work better with light armed troops than with cavalry, simply because they're faster on their feet. You see this happening later on very often. Spartan armies do this a lot. When they're being attacked by light troops, they send out their own forces in what I call a cascading charge. Basically, they send their cavalry, followed by the light troops, followed by the youngest of the hoplites, followed by the rest of the hoplites. So the idea is that the fastest troops get there the first, and the rest follows in order of speed, basically, to make sure that there's constantly an enemy approaching, and there's constantly one that's upon you, and there's constantly one that's already sort of beyond you and trying to regroup for another run, so that you get this impression that, oh no, this is never going to stop, I'm never going to be able to hold this off. And in practice, this always works, or almost always works. The enemy is not going to stand its ground against one of these charges, but the idea is that you have a clear separation between the youngest of the hoplites and the older ones, and you send the youngest out first because they're faster on their feet, be able to support the light infantry by being there with them.
This is a convenient point to stop today's podcast. I hope you all enjoyed it. I would like to thank regular panelists Lindsay Powell and Murray Dahm for their contributions, and also, of course, our expert guest, Roel Konijnendijk. And my thanks also, as usual, to Angus Wallace, our much suffering producer, who, especially tonight, will have a difficult time piecing all the disparate bits together into a coherent whole. Well, I hope to see you all next time, and from all of us, good day.